Hello and welcome to today's pod. It is, of course, the Irish marketing podcast powered by IMJ and Tinpot Productions. I'm Daryl from Tinpot, and today we are popping a tiny metaphorical champagne cork to celebrate our 10th edition of the podcast. What better way to celebrate than with a special interview with Richard Shotton, behavioural science Svengali, co-author of the recently released and universally acclaimed book, Hacking the Human Mind. He was in town recently for the Sounding Out event and was featured on episode 7, but there were so many interesting points that we couldn't fit them all in, so today you're going to hear the rest of that interview, mostly related to the new book. We spoke about Richard's lightbulb moment when it came to behavioural science and advertising.
To see this ability to take a study from 1960, apply it 40, 50 years later, see the results, it got me hooked.
And why our cognitive functions make us bad candidates for focus groups.
Thinking as to humans, as swimming as to cats. Now, we can do it, but we prefer not to.
So settle back, relax and enjoy the next 15 minutes with a relentlessly inquiring mind, Richard's, not mine, obviously. And before we get to the book, I started by asking Richard where his interesting company name came from. And it struck me just as I always think a good name is a very important thing. Astroten, where did that come from? There's a story behind it, I'm guessing.
There definitely is. There is. So I set up Astroten about 2018, just after I'd written The Choice Factor, and people had come to me asking to apply some of these ideas at their company. And I was desperate not to call my company Richard Shotton Consulting. And it was getting increasingly time pressing for me to come up with a name. And I was going through textbooks and psychology books, trying to find something that was relevant to my field of applying behavioural science. And I found this amazing study, Charles Hoffling study back in the 1960s, where he comes up with the idea that there's too much obedience to authority. And I kind of like that because I thought, well, that's one good reason for leaving an agency and setting up on your own. And what he did for his study was he pretended to be a doctor, rang up nurses and said, quick, you've got to give 100 milligrams of Astroten to patient Jones. And there were two transgressions involved here. Firstly, nurses weren't meant to take orders over the phone from a doctor they hadn't met. And then secondly, when they got to the dispensary and there was a bottle of Astroten drug, it said very clearly, no more than 10 milligrams. But despite this, 95% of nurses still try to administer the drug. And Hoffling said, what's going on here is people are stopping thinking and they're just defaulting to following whatever the position of power says. So there's this kind of dangerous white coat system in which people in power are listened to unthinkingly. And I thought, okay, that's kind of fitting for me. I no longer want to be told what to do in a giant bureaucracy, so I kind of like that name. Registered the name, with the government, registered the website. And then unfortunately, about 6 months later, I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to call my company Astroten, I should at least read the original paper. I can't just get it out of a textbook. And I got the paper, and about one paragraph in, I realised that the drug in question is not Astroten, it's Astrogen, and that there had been a typo in a textbook back in the 1970s, and then all these other books that purporting to directly report on the experiment had contained that error, so they hadn't bothered to look at the original work. But by that stage, I was so far down the line, I thought, I kind of quite like the fact that there's a little error in here, and Astroten sounds so much better than Astrogen, which definitely sounds like a medication. So there is a very convoluted and long-winded story behind the name.
And if we talk a little bit about the new book, so you've taken basically 17 different brands to give 17 different examples.
Yeah.
But I picked out those two or three examples of brands. They're all very interesting, but there were two or three that stuck out for me in particular. And I wonder if you just might kind of elucidate on the thinking behind their success and how it worked in their case. So one of the first ones that I picked out was the Snickers and trigger moments. And just to maybe explain why Snickers had basically figured out that if you associate hunger with the solution of eating a Snickers that it turned out to be very effective. And obviously there was the science behind that. Do you want to maybe explain to us kind of why and how that worked?
So there's a series of experiments from behavioural scientists into this idea of the intention to action gap. So you've got intention, I intend to exercise more, I intend to buy a chocolate bar. And then you've got action, I go and do some press ups, I buy the chocolate bar. And the two things often don't correlate. So often you can increase people's intention, it just doesn't translate into action. So there's a psychologist at the University of Bath, and I talk about her work in the book, called Sarah Milne. And she does a series of experiments that shows motivation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for behaviour change. What you need to do is associate whatever behaviour you want to encourage with a very clear time, place, or mood. So rather than saying, I'm going to take some vitamins, you say, I'm going to take some vitamins after breakfast. You associate the act of vitamin taking with a very clear time. And what that tends to do is when that moment rolls round, it acts as a catalyst to convert the vague intention into actual behaviour change. So her argument is many businesses and brands and governments, they do the hard work of motivating people to want to do something, but their campaigns fail because they haven't associated that moment of consumption or moment of behaviour change with a very clear time, place, or mood. Now, you look then at Snickers and you can see they are certainly a brand that haven't made that mistake. Now, most of their ads don't talk about how wonderful Snickers are, but instead they are very relentlessly focused on associating the consumption of Snickers with a very clear mood, essentially. The feeling of confusion that comes from hunger. You're not you when you're hungry. That's the creation of a trigger moment. And it's one of the things I think Snickers does so well.
It's quite a simple and effective tool once you know what it is. It's not necessarily difficult to do that if you know that it works.
I think you're right, that the main step is recognizing it's necessary. Most people think, well, if I just make people love my product, like my product enough, sales will follow. But Milne's argument is that will happen to a degree, but it'll be a very, very inefficient conversion number. What you need to do is create this trigger moment. And you go through an awful number of products and you can see this happening again and again. I mean, if you stick in the world of chocolate bars, think about Kit Kat. Have a break, have a Kit Kat. It's not about the tastiness of Kit Kat, but it is a very clear association with an opportunity to consume. And it's this melding of the two things together that's so powerful.
So this is your third book in this area. I'm interested to know the evolution of your own thinking. I mean, you clearly have, a very strong passion for all of this research and the science that goes behind it and behavioural science. But I'm wondering, are there any of your opinions that perhaps you felt in your other book that may have changed or adapted over time now that you've been working in this field for so long?
So, yeah, this is my third book, first that I've co-authored, so co-wrote this with Michael Aaron Flicker. I think the biggest change of the third book is not necessarily about the biases, because I think they're quite eternal. It's the style of the book. So the first two, every chapter is about a bias, and I cover the bias, academic evidence, my experiments, implications. What I've tried to do with this third book is each chapter is about a brand. Start with the little potted history of the brand, and then explain one or two principles that drive the success of that brand. And the aim there is just to try and make it easier to understand and more concrete. Because what I noticed when I first became excited about this field is if I just took people through the experiments, some people got very enthused, but some people were left feeling a bit cold. But then you give them an example of one of these principles being used, and suddenly it's much more understandable and people get excited about applying it. So by basing each chapter around a very well-known brand, a very successful brand, hopefully it makes it less academic, less abstract, more practical, and easier to apply. That's certainly the aim.
You have been quite critical of traditional, or at least some traditional market research, saying that most focus groups are wrong. So if you were to speak to a marketer, what should they do in preference to focus groups if you believe they don't work, or is it just that sometimes some focus groups don't work?
Yeah, with all these things, there's a time and a place. But that said, you've got to be really careful with direct questioning, because if you stop someone and say, why did you buy a particular lager, or why did you buy a particular pair of trainers, when they think about answering, they will answer in a very considered, reflective way. And they will answer as if they were a calculating machine. But we know that when people are deciding, they often do so very, very quickly. So one of the themes from behavioural science is this idea that people are cognitive misers, which is a phrase from Susan Fiske at Princeton. She speaks in quite academic language, but her former colleague Daniel Kahneman puts it a bit better. He says, thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. Now, we can do it, but we prefer not to. So his argument is, rather than us taking a long time to think about what pint to order or what pair of trainers to buy, we will often use these quick heuristics or rules of thumb to make fast, snap decisions. And those rules of thumb are prone to biases, but we're not necessarily aware of them. So you question someone in a focus group and they will tell you, well, I bought that lager because, it tastes very nice and that the price is right. What they won't admit is they often will use these super quick and emotional snap decisions. Like, oh, I ordered that beer because, well, that's what everyone else was ordering. We often don't even have full access to that kind of decision-making process because it's so quick. So you put someone in a focus group, you will get a subset of reasons about why they might buy. But all these kind of more irrational quirks of human nature, they'll often be missed. So maybe there is a small role for focus group and surveys, but you've got to treat them with a lot of caution because often they'll send you off in the wrong direction.
You are obviously a very well acknowledged authority on behavioural science, and you've proven it. And I'm sure you've spoken to a lot of brands and advertising marketers where you've been able to convince them or show them results. But I'm wondering, from your own personal point of view, was there a eureka moment for you where you kind of realised, put behavioural science and marketing and advertising together and said, wow, this really works?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So my background was as a media planner. I didn't come to behavioural science from an academic angle. I started as a media planner at Dentsu and was later at Publicis. And there was a very specific moment. So it was 2004, working for the NHS in Britain, or they were the client, and we were working on the Give Blood campaign. So expecting people to altruistically volunteer to give blood. And as I was on that campaign, I happened to pick up a copy of The Tipping Point. Do you remember that Malcolm Gladwell book? Yeah. Super popular at the time. And he's got all sorts of kind of theories. But almost as a tangent, on right at the back, he mentions two psychologists called Latané and Darling. And they did a series of studies in the 60s into what became known as the bystander effect, which is essentially, if you ask lots of people for help, there's a diffusion of responsibility and everyone leaves it up to someone else to sort out the problem. And I can remember reading that, and as you know, it was almost like a light bulb went off. I thought, wow, this is exactly the problem we've got on the blood service. We're going out and saying blood stock's low in Britain, please donate. But Latané and Darley would suggest that we're falling victim of the bystander effect. Every person in Britain is just leaving it up to their neighbour because they don't want to go through the hassle themselves. So went and spoke to the creative agency, a brilliant planner down there called Charlie Snow, and said, well, look, why don't we stop saying blood stock's low in Britain, please donate? And why don't we start saying blood stocks are low in, Birmingham or Herne Hill in London or, Brighton, tailoring the message to a particular place, just to create a little bit more of a sense of personal responsibility. That was a very crude attempt to use this principle, but even that crude attempt, I think, boosted our response rates by 10 or 15%. And for me, to see this ability to take a study from 1960, apply it, 40, 50 years later, see the results, it got me hooked on thinking, well, what other studies are there? And I was surprised that there was this huge body of work just waiting to be harnessed. So ever since then, 21 years ago, I've just tried to run my own experiments, set up my own agency in this field, but always coming back to what has been proven in peer-reviewed, controlled circumstances that marketers, media planners, creatives could use practically.
That was Richard Shotton speaking to us about 3 weeks ago when he was in Dublin. Now, before we sign off today's podcast, I want to give you a tiny tease for what is coming up on next week's podcast. And if you want to know the definitive difference between a content creator and an influencer and how to get the best out of a content creator campaign, we've got your back, all of your questions answered and your answers questioned as we hear from some of the top Irish talent in this pretty much exploding sector. We'll have some more insights from our previously recorded conversation with Claire Hyland and Thinkhouse, as well as Aoife Morgan-Smith from Collaborations Agency, and some more audio from the Youth Culture Uncovered 2025 event in Thinkhouse HQ recently, including some thoughts from Vogue Williams, Cassie Stokes and James Kavanagh.
Hello brand managers, James Kavanagh, content creator and former Thinkhouser here. When I think about a good brand collaboration, I think of a well-written, concise brief. Too many times I've received briefs that are 10 to 15 pages long, full of irrelevant information.
That will be ready for your ears next week, but that's it for today's podcast. If you've enjoyed, please hit follow and help us to get the word out there. It's all recorded, edited and mixed at Tinpot Productions Studios. We're back next Friday, wherever you pick your pods. Thanks for listening.